There's an awful lot of big games in college football on Saturday, and there are a lot of programs, coaches, and athletes who can change the narrative and change the way we think and perceive them by their performance on Saturday. There are, I think, 6 games that feature ranked opponents taking on one another, and there are opportunities for schools to flip the script on just how we view them all. And I think that makes for a really intriguing Saturday, but also a really terrifying Saturday, because if you're not successful in flipping the script and changing the narrative about you as a coach, a program, a player, etc., where do you go from here? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I have 8 coaches on a list of guys who have the ability to change the narrative or prove their worth or flip the script on the trajectory of their programs by just games this weekend. And so I've put them into those camps. Who has the ability to rewrite the ship? Who's fallen on hard times? Who has the ability to change the narrative about them as a coach? And who can prove their worth to their programs this weekend? So the first are the narrative changers, those who can change the idea that they don't have the ability to win the big game. And the first one is James Franklin of Penn State. For all of James Franklin's accomplishments at Penn State, and there are more than you think, he still carries this moniker as a coach who cannot win the big game. Now, do with that what you will. James Franklin has won a Big Ten championship during the height of Urban Meyer's tenure at Ohio State. Clearly, they can win the big game. And yet, I think the national perception of Penn State and James Franklin has been they've been close but not good enough. They have the ability to change that this weekend with a win, and if they can do it decisively at home in the whiteout against Iowa, that will go a long way in helping change the narrative that Penn State can't win the big game. Now, the problem with that narrative, the problem with people knocking you with you can't win the big game, is anytime you win a big game, they will tell you, oh, well, that wasn't a big game. And it's the same thing that Ryan Day goes through at Ohio State, which is why he's number 2 on the list. I have seen Ohio State fans say that Ryan Day can't win the big game, which is asinine, because you don't coach in the national championship game if you can't win the big game. By definition, a college football playoff semifinal is a big game. The Big Ten championship game is a big game. And when you win the Big Ten championship game and win your way to the college football playoff, you have won big games. Now, has Ryan Day won a national championship? No. And if that is the criticism levied against him, fine. There's no arguing that. Do I think it's preposterous that if that's the knock against a head coach is, well, he hasn't won the national championship. Oh, well, during the middle of Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney alternating championships for damn near a decade, somebody hasn't won a national championship in their 5th season? Holy cow. It's a stupid criticism. But it gets dumber when you say, well, Ryan Day hasn't won the big game. Yes, he has. James Franklin, likewise, has won the big game. Winning your conference championship game is a big game, no matter who you beat in that game. It is undeniably a big game. Ryan Day beat Michigan in his first season. No matter what Michigan's record is in that game, winning that game is a big deal, and it's winning a big game. Now, has Ryan Day blown 2 touchdown leads twice in college football playoff semifinals? Yes. Has he been beaten by Michigan in back-to-back years? Yes. But to say that he doesn't win the big game is ridiculous, and yet that is the knock on him. And on the flip side of that matchup, that number 6 Ohio State is going to South Bend to play number 9 Notre Dame. Marcus Freeman has the same knock. Now, I don't know that it's fair against Marcus Freeman, and it might be more of a strictly a knock against Notre Dame as a program that it's been a while since they won a New Year's Six game. But there's an attachment to Marcus Freeman that he can't win the big game, and that any time Notre Dame has to play somebody of any stature whatsoever, they are unsuccessful. And it's not unfair to the program. It's unfair to Marcus Freeman. It's not as if he's had a multitude of opportunities to win said big games. He's going into week number 4 of his second year as the head coach. It isn't as if he's had ample opportunities like James Franklin or Ryan Day and been unsuccessful. And yet, he can change the narrative surrounding their program if they can beat Ohio State. Because there are those who believe, and I'm on the fringe of, I think Notre Dame is close, but I don't think Notre Dame is a college football playoff contender yet. There are those who believe that Notre Dame is solidly a college football playoff contender. They have the ability to show that off on Saturday if they can get a win at home against Ohio State. It would be a big win. Make no mistake about it. It would be big time. But I don't know that there's a ton of pressure on Marcus Freeman as there is on other coaches on this list. So those three, James Franklin, Ryan Day, and Marcus Freeman, are the coaches who can change the narrative surrounding them and their programs in the big football, on the big college football Saturday that's coming up. The second group I have is the coaches who have fallen on hard times. And this is where it gets somewhat interesting because you have a guy like Dabo Swinney. Clemson was as high as you can be in the college football world and have obviously not sustained that level of success and got definitely knocked for their season opening loss to Duke, and rightfully so. Duke was the better program. Duke was the better team that night. Clemson's not in the top 25. Florida State is the number 4 team in the country, and they've got to go to Clemson. There are legitimate questions about the Tigers' future in the college football landscape. And they can all be assuaged, massaged, whatever you want to say. They can all be taken away if Clemson can beat Florida State on Saturday. Because if they can, those questions end. If Clemson can just beat Florida State, and if they can do it handily, there is no more questions about what the future of the Clemson football program looks like, whether their dynasty, and I don't know that they were ever a dynasty, but whether their run at the top elite levels of college football are over or not. Because they win over number 4 Florida State, a team that should have lost to Boston College last week. Ends all of those questions. All Clemson has to do, and I realize easier said than done, but when you've fallen on hard times, and I think it is without a doubt true that Clemson has fallen on hard times, Dabo Swinney can lift that program back up with a victory on Saturday. Easier said than done, I know. But I just think it's possible to flip that script. Similarly for UCLA. Now, Chip Kelly has both, I think, struggled and succeeded at UCLA. It is a slightly more difficult job than I think people think it is. And Chip Kelly, much like Dabo Swinney, led a program at a different time in the history of college football. And what I mean by that is when you take a look back at going back to, the late 80s, early 90s, you had a college football that was definitely regionalized. And then there were some teams that were able to separate themselves from the pack and become those national brands, right? And at the time, you had these regionalized programs where it was basically the job of boosters to pay for players to come to these schools. And then in the late 90s, mid 90s to late 2010s, became the facilities / uniforms arms race. And Dabo Swinney and Chip Kelly were both in the right place at the right time. And you see some of these programs stay significant and stay culturally relevant in spite of the flavors of the month, right? Like the U. Miami was really good during a tenure of like, hey, let's just pay these guys to come here. The kind of wild, wild west of the NCAA. Same for Nebraska. And then there started to be some crackdowns. There started to be some like, hey, we got to do something about this type situations. And that success started to go away. Then you got the time frame of facilities / uniforms arms races, where Clemson and Oregon invested heavily in their facilities, invested heavily in their uniforms, putting the brand image out there. So Chip Kelly and Dabo Swinney were at the right place at the right time. Also, Chip Kelly, widely viewed as an offensive innovator at a time when some schools were afraid to innovate offensively. Now, that's not a knock against either of those guys. It's just the reality of the situation. Chip Kelly, I think, is still a pretty good football coach. And UCLA is a harder and more difficult job than I think people think it is. Now, I don't know if Chip Kelly has fallen as on hard times as Dabo Swinney has, but he has not reached nearly the levels of success that I think UCLA fans thought they were going to reach when they hired Chip Kelly, and the national perception of Chip Kelly when he was hired after the success that he had at Oregon. I'm certain people didn't think that, UCLA being ranked where they are was something that people thought would be a usual for the Bruins underneath Chip Kelly. I think if I told you that, like, hey, UCLA is going to routinely be ranked in like 17 through 25, they're 22 right now. If I told you they were going to be 17 through 25 usually under Chip Kelly, when he got hired, you wouldn't think like, oh yeah, I know, that makes a lot of sense. That's probably where I'd pick him. You probably had him, 8 to 15 usually, and they just haven't got there yet. But if UCLA can go on the road and beat number 11 Utah, I think that might flip the script a little bit on the way we look at and talk about UCLA and Chip Kelly, because they got to get some wins going into the Big Ten, because it's going to get a little bit more difficult. Now, I think the Pac-12 might be one of, if not the best conference in 2023. But in the past couple of seasons, that has not been the case. And they have not pounced and not capitalized and not built a juggernaut monster that strikes fear into everybody else in the conference. UCLA doesn't fear UCLA. Washington, Oregon, Utah don't fear UCLA the way that I think people thought they might when Chip Kelly got hired. So he can flip that script. And then so can, finally, Kirk Ferentz. Iowa, I've said this on the podcast before that if you have a crap offense in 2023, it's because you're choosing to do so. And Iowa fits that bill where Kirk Ferentz has done a great job there for a long time. Again, not an easy place to win. And yet, they stink offensively, and it's on purpose. Because they have failed to innovate, they have failed to adapt, they have failed to evolve, and still value and play the game a way that really not many other schools do. And that's good enough to win you most years 8 or 9 games. But very rarely are you going to beat somebody that you shouldn't playing the way that Iowa does. And that is a problem. So they're going on the road into the whiteout at Penn State, number 7 ranked team in the country. And they have a challenge ahead of them. Kirk Ferentz needs to average 25 points a game for his son to keep his job. They might struggle to score 25 points at Penn State on Saturday night. But if they can go into Happy Valley and win, I just wonder what that does for Kirk Ferentz and for Iowa as a whole, because there are legitimate questions on whether the game has passed him by, whether he is still the right man for the job at that program. And I think it's one of those be careful what you wish for scenarios. But I do wonder what a win for Iowa could do for the perception and the thoughts around Kirk Ferentz. Because I think he's a good football coach, and I think he should go down in the College Football Hall of Fame for what he's done at Iowa, because the New Year's 6 bowl games that they have played in, because of the job he's done, can't be overstated. But at the same time, you can't ride the coattails of what you did 15 years ago in 2023. You just can't do it. And every day that they don't show market improvement is a day that I wonder if the game is a day that somebody else in the country got better and Iowa got worse. But a win in Happy Valley goes a long way on Saturday night. So the coaches who can change their fallen on hard time status, Kirk Ferentz, Chip Kelly, Dabo Swinney, all have that opportunity on Saturday. And the final group of coaches who can prove just how much they're worth to their programs are Jim Harbaugh and Lane Kiffin. Jim Harbaugh's coming back off of a suspension where Michigan, they didn't play poorly by any stretch of the imagination. Averaged 32 points a game. Had really no issues beating UNLV, Bowling Green, and East Carolina. And they shouldn't have any issues beating Bowling Green, East Carolina, and UNLV. But they were just sort of glorified scrimmages almost. Michigan takes on Rutgers on Saturday at home in the Big House. And should that game be close? No, it shouldn't. But if Michigan can score 56 on Rutgers on Saturday, it's going to be, I think, real hard for Jim Harbaugh not to look around that post-game press conference and say, I can't help but notice we only averaged 32 in the first 3 games, and then the one game I come back, we scored 56 and kind of just dominated our opponent. Power 5 conference game. I think it would be really hard for Jim Harbaugh not to think and act like that. And if that happens, he should. Because in what appears to be a somewhat contentious relationship with his employer, every time he can earn leverage, I think he's going to use it, point to it, and say, oh, yeah, damn, crazy. Wow. Did you see how good we were when I was there? And I don't know what the response is. You can prove your worth to your school and your employer by putting the boot to the tush of Rutgers on Saturday. And the same is true to Ole Miss. If you were to look and compare the rosters of Ole Miss and Alabama for Saturday, and you just played the game on paper, Alabama should win that game by 25. But they don't play the game on paper. And Ole Miss has a legitimate chance to grab a road victory. And for Lane Kiffin to have and keep that offensive genius, the wonderkind, which at some point, like, he's not a kid anymore, but to earn and keep that moniker. Because I don't know how you go into that game and think that it's a slam dunk, surefire thing that Alabama wins at home. And I yesterday I mentioned that I appreciate Lane Kiffin because he's unafraid to say what he thinks and unafraid to say the wrong thing. And if he does say the wrong thing, he goes, oh, you know what? That was my bad. But he's got the opportunity to prove his worth on Saturday, because they are not favored. Alabama conceivably has a roster of better players than Ole Miss does. And yet I think the conventional wisdom and the conventional thinking is the Ole Miss is probably going to win. And I don't know how many other coaches that could be leading that program that would give you the confidence that Ole Miss is going to win more than Lane Kiffin does. And I'm staunchly opposed to the contract extension game all the time, where Brian Kelly did this like every 2 years at Notre Dame, where he pretended to flirt with a NFL job so he can come back to his boss and go, you know what, the Philadelphia Eagles really want to pay me $8 million a year. I don't want to go. It sure would be nice if you just paid me a little bit more and I'll stay. And then they stayed. And I'm staunchly opposed to that. You signed a contract, you agreed to it. If you want paid more, well, I guess you should have fought a little harder during the negotiation. But I'm telling you, if Lane Kiffin grabs a win at Bryant-Denning on Saturday, by the time they go to get on the bus after the stadium, he should have laid out your boy would like a contract extension, and your boy would like to be paid XYZ. Because if they can go into Alabama, they can go to Tuscaloosa and get a win. Lane Kiffin has proved his worth to that program and to any potential suitors as well. So those, Jim Harbaugh and Lane Kiffin, are the coaches who have the ability to prove their worth in big games on Saturday. That'll do it for today's edition of the Daily Huddle. I'm Garrett Searight. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you can hit the subscribe button, that'd be great. Hit the thumbs up as well. It gets us in front of more college football fans. That's always a good thing. Also, if you're listening on the podcast, you can give us a 5-star review. That goes a really long way in helping us out. We'll be back tomorrow for more college football talk. We'll see you then here on Saturday Glory.